Do you know what the number one search term is that people find my website with? Or even this YouTube channel? Believe it or not, it's can you grow tomatoes outdoors in Scotland? And the thing is, that's absolutely the wrong question to ask. So let's talk about the right question to ask. And then I'll give you the answer as well. Lots of people grow tomatoes in Scotland, but the most common way is like this, in a greenhouse. Because a greenhouse gives you a bit of protection from the elements, a bit of reliability, and, generations and generations before us have done it this way, so we know it works. However, what about outdoors? Because you will see so many people from, say, England, south of the border, growing their tomatoes outdoors really successfully. So why is it less common in Scotland? Well, I've been on a bit of an adventure over the last few years. Started, I think, about 3 years ago. And I have tested it, tried it, and I've got some awesome results for you. So the first thing we're going to do then is I'm going to leave these little guys in their nice cosy greenhouse, and I'm going to take you out to my tomato growing space outdoors. Yes? Outdoors. This is maybe not the easiest space to film in, but I hope you can see that I've got two lots of tomatoes out here. One set in my raised bed, and another set in this big vertical planter system. So I'm growing tomatoes outdoors in a raised bed like most people do, but I'm also growing them in basically a big pot or a container. Why am I doing it in different ways? Well, actually, I'm also growing two completely different types of plant. And that's the big key thing I'm going to talk about in a second, is the type of plant. And it doesn't mean what you think. So the whole thing then, growing tomatoes in Scotland. Can you grow tomatoes outdoors in Scotland? Well, yes, quite clearly you can, because I'm doing it. But the question is it worth it? And what that means is, will you get enough of a harvest to make it worthwhile? Or should you just stick to growing them in the greenhouse because you know you're going to get a good crop in there? And it comes down to something that I didn't even know existed. And I only found out about this last year. And I'm going to share it with you guys because it's so important. It's this. Okay, welcome to my garden here in East Lothian on the east coast of Scotland. It's what we call the Central Belt. It's that kind of almost middle area across the country, which is way further north than a lot of places in, say, America and even some in Canada that get extreme weather. We don't, but still the weather we get is vital. You need to understand that for growing tomatoes because, right, so let's start with tomatoes then. Tomatoes are a warm season crop, basically a summer crop for us, because they originate from South America where it's lovely and warm and reliable heat and all that kind of gorgeousness. That's what the plant's like. Can we give them that in Scotland? Well, I've already said that we reliably grow tomatoes in the greenhouse, so we clearly can for some of the year. But the problem is, and you maybe don't realise this, there is a set amount of time that your tomatoes need that for in order to produce decent harvests for you. And that's what I want to talk about because it is mind-blowing. It changes everything, honestly. Right, let's start with the really obvious thing about my weather. Anyone who watches our videos knows I complain constantly about how much it rains here. And that plays a big factor in things. So let's go back 3 years to my first attempt at growing tomatoes outdoors. I just had some plants in pots sitting here because this is the sunniest but also sheltered part of the garden. So for a plant that likes nice warm temperatures, this is perfect. But back then I didn't know what I know now about how many days of perfect weather the tomatoes might need. So I did actually get a harvest, but it wasn't a lot. And I have to be honest, at that point I decided it's not worth it. It's not worth grown tomatoes outdoors in Scotland. I'll stick to my greenhouse. But something happened that changed all of that. And it was this. We've got a mate gardener, Scott, and he lives in Colorado, up in the mountains of Colorado.
That's the problem when making a video with Eli and Kate. I always get outvoted when it comes to the dishes.
His climate is completely different from ours. So between us, we have really good fun chatting about each other's weathers and comparing our gardens. And we're constantly kind of texting each other like, oh, it's sunny today, or, it's this temperature, or, when I know it's still quite cold over there with him, I send him videos of us having like beer and shorts and t-shirt in the garden and stuff, because that's what you do. But he gets his own back, folks. He totally gets his own back, don't worry. But he had said to me about he grows all of his tomatoes outdoors because it's too hot for him in summer to grow in the greenhouse. So we kind of hatched a plan, and last year, over the entire season, we did a grow along where we both grew the same tomatoes in raised beds, and Scott tried growing some along in his greenhouse with me. And we both learned heaps from this. And it all started because we talked about the varieties. And I went off, I'm not going to lie, folks, I went off down a rabbit hole of research, because that's kind of what I'm like. I can't help myself. Yeah. But in doing that though, I learned the most vital thing, and it is this. My garden season is one thing, and not everyone's is the same, not even people who are in a relatively close proximity to me. Hence, remember earlier I said that folk that were in England, country that's south of Scotland, they quite often grow tomatoes outdoors. Well, in physical terms, they're only a few hundred miles away. But in terms of their season, their climate, their weather, it's very different. But it's more than that. Your tomato plants, all the different varieties, have their own seasons. So you need to match the tomato variety with your season so that the two of them are perfect. And that way, you're not going to end up with heaps of green tomatoes at the end of the year that didn't get the chance to ripen. And that's what will make it worth growing tomatoes outdoors. So let me tell you about that then. To be able to do that though, you need to be able to work out what your season is in your garden. And it goes like this. Okay, tomato plants need an absolute bare minimum of 10C plus to survive. Okay, when it gets any lower than that, they just kind of give up. They don't really prosper, they'll just stall. And obviously, if you want a good crop, you need them to thrive rather than just survive. So you need to make sure that you can give them a reliable above 10C every single day and night. So to work out your season then, the first thing I want you to do is to find that date in your diary where you know it will always be above 10C in your garden, even overnight. And that is the start of your season for growing tomatoes outdoors. Now, for me, that's the start of June at the earliest. But here's the thing. You obviously need it to be warmer than that for the plant to thrive and start to produce fruit and then ripen the fruit. So we're starting to look at temperatures of above 20C for that plant to be truly happy. So I don't want it to be down at that 10C for too long after I've put them out. But there is a flip side. If we need it to be around that 20C and above to get the tomatoes to set fruit and ripen, then what happens at the other end? Because at some point it's going to start getting cold again as we're through autumn and winter. And if that happens, your plants might be covered in little green tomatoes, but you're not going to get them to ripen. So you'll end up in that situation we all know, where you end up making jars and jars and jars of green tomato chutney and green tomato ketchup. And well, actually it wasn't too bad because I discovered I quite like green tomato ketchup. But That's the end of the season for you. So I want you to look at things and say, right, when does it start getting too cold so that my tomatoes can't reliably, during the day and at night, be in that warm, cosy region of, say, 15C and above. Really, I'm probably talking about 18C, but around that. Because once you start to get to that point where you can't guarantee that anymore, the fruit are going to stop ripening. So that's the end of your growing season for your tomatoes. So look at that start date and end date and count how many days you've got. That is your gross growing season. Now I say gross because remember, there are going to be times in there where you might just get bad weather. You might get a couple of weeks of really poor, grey, wet weather, even in midsummer. I know I will get a lot of that. That's the problem in Scotland. But that means that even though I might have the beginning of June to, for me, mid-September, it roughly works out about 90 days, but that's not guaranteed to be 90 gloriously perfect days. So what I need to do then is take that knowledge and find tomato varieties where their season is less than 90 days. And that's what I did. Okay then, we've got 4 indeterminate tomatoes here. Would it shock you to know that 2 of them, the one on each end, is a beefsteak? Yes, it's Black Krim. It has a season of between 70 and 90 days. So this was a tomato I grew out here just as the one to take a chance on. Now, I'll be honest with you, I didn't think it was going to work, because if my season on the best possible times is going to be 90 days, and this guy needs between 70 and 90 days, you can see I was a bit hesitant, but actually it did fantastic. I got heaps of fruit from it. Now the other 2, these have cherry tomatoes. One is Sun Gold and one is Sweet Millions. These guys both have a very, very similar season. 62 days for the Sun Gold and 65 days for the Sweet Million. So that's within my season. So that's why so many people in Scotland grow Sun Gold. But all those ones that have a much longer season, for instance, Barry's Crazy Cherry, it's also a cherry tomato, but it's a multiflora. So it means it grows a stupendous amount of tomatoes on every single truss. But because of that, it needs a longer season, longer than I could comfortably give it. It wants at least 75 days. And given there's going to be an awful lot of fruit on it, I thought I won't risk it with that one. But I grew that one in the greenhouse, and I'll explain why that works in a second. Now, I said earlier on that I grow different types of tomatoes. So let me tell you about the ones I grow in containers. So most of us will know the difference between indeterminate and determinate tomatoes. Indeterminate being the big tall ones that will keep growing, and determinate being the ones that will stick to a set height. That's your bush tomatoes. But determinates have lots of different types of tomatoes in that group, and that's what I grow in my containers. Now that first year I grew tomatoes here in pots, and this is what I grew, something called a dwarf tomato or a micro tomato, and they never get more than about that size in total. They're perfect for pots. Last year and this year I'm using this. It's still a container growing system. It's just one that's designed for big plants, so you can use it for fruits and veggies and stuff. But it's the same concept. And again, I'm growing my little dwarf or micro tomatoes in this one. Now the tomatoes themselves are normal cherry tomatoes. It's just the plants are smaller, but they have an even shorter season. So in this one, I've got a Mori Dewdrop, and I think last year I also grew Farthest North. And we're looking at a season of between 40 and 50 days. Yup. So from small plant to harvesting fruit, under 2 months. It's quite astounding. So you can see now why the season in your garden and the season of the plants is the key to getting the best crops, because you want everything to have time to grow, produce fruit and ripen the fruit. Right, let me tell you why the greenhouse is such a good thing and why it's so popular for growing tomatoes in Scotland. So the thing with having a greenhouse, people talk about it extending your season, and that's because I can be putting little tomato plants in my greenhouse long before I can be putting them in the garden, months before. And again, plants will continue to ripen in my greenhouse for weeks, maybe even a month, longer than they will in the garden. So that means my season in the greenhouse is longer than the one in the garden, which is why I've got these plants in there. In here, I've got two of those multiflora type plants I told you about, Barry's Crazy Cherry and Lucie Foy. Both of them give you masses of cherry tomatoes, but they have a much longer season, and this way I've got almost a guarantee of fantastic crops. I've also got two other beefsteak tomatoes here, Marmande and Orange Oxheart. And again, it's to guarantee I get that much bigger harvest. So yes, I'm growing tomatoes outdoors in Scotland, and yes, I think it's absolutely worth it. You get a good harvest, but there is one other factor at play that affects us. It may not affect everyone, but it's a big factor, and unfortunately, it's a bit rubbish. It's something called blight. Now, do you remember I was saying how it's a very wet climate here in Scotland? Well, in summer, when you have that moisture and you have warmth, it is the perfect place for blight. And what blight is? It's a fungal-like disease that will wipe out all of your tomato plants very quickly. They start off with little brown splodges on them which grow and completely kill the leaves, the stems, and will infect the fruits as well. And once that happens, it's time to cut everything down. And again, we're back to green tomato chutney and green tomato ketchup, folks. And that happened to me last year. But here's the thing. By the point we got that, it was late blight. We were towards the end of the season. We'd already been harvesting heaps of tomatoes. So yes, it was disappointing, but it wasn't the end of the world. Not even close. So I still think it's worth it. But like I said, it's all about you putting the work in and looking at your season and the seasons of the varieties you want to grow. And varieties are key, folks. And if you want some help with that, this video is me chatting about the varieties we all grow and why. It might help you. See you, folks.